One feature that is rarely talked about when it comes to data binding is that we can specify a binding mode between two different properties. To perform an example of this, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio and proceed to create a new page. Let's specify that the page be called, for example, binding modes. Let's go to the app.xaml.cs file to indicate that this page is the initial page. Remember to write binding modes with S as initial page, not without it, because otherwise it refers to a totally different thing. I'm going to go to the XAML file and I'm going to cut this pair of vertical option and horizontal option properties, and I'm going to paste them as part of the stack layout. Then I'm going to remove the label control and create a couple of entry elements instead. The first entry control, we have a placeholder equal to source. I will also assign a name equal to source. I specify a font size equal to 50, and as text I set it to be equal to initial. I will proceed to copy and paste this entry control. I'm going to change the property placeholder for target, and also I'm going to indicate that the text of this entry control is equal to, and I'm going to take as source of information the first control that we created previously. Then I specify binding source. I use the reference of the control through extra reference, and I indicate the name of the control, which is source. Subsequently, I will indicate that the path is going to be equal to text, since I want to take the information of the text property of the first control. And finally, as part of the binding, we have a property that is called mode, which has different available values that we could use and that behave differently. Let's start by studying the type of binding called onetime. Before starting the execution of the application, I will change the name of this entry to target. Let's start the execution of the application to see how it behaves. We have this pair of entry controls and see what is going to happen. If I start typing some text in the first control, nothing happens in the second control. If I type something in the second entry control, nothing happens in the first entry control either. What has happened, and I don't know if you have noticed, is that the initial value of the first entry control has been assigned. We can conclude that this binding mode will assign the binding only the first time the application is executed. That is why it is called onetime. Let's try the second type called one way. Let's see how the application behaves. Here we can see it. I'm going to modify the text of the first entry control, and this time when the value of the first entry control is modified, the value of the second entry control is also modified. However, if I modify the second entry, this does not affect the behavior of the first entry. Let's test the third type, which is a type called two-way. Let's start the execution of the application. In this case, let's write some text in the first entry control, and again the content of the second entry is modified. But if this time I modify the content of the second entry, look how the change is also reflected in the first text box. So, this type of binding performs a setup so that if the source property is modified, the target property changes and vice versa. There is also a binding mode called one way to source. Let's see how the assignment of this value behaves. Notice that in this occasion, no text appeared in the entry controls. And this is because if we try to modify the value of the entry control, the change is not reflected in the second entry. However, if we type text in the second entry, the content is also set in the first entry control. So in this case, the binding will be applied from the target property to the source property. Finally, we have a last value, which is the value called default, which is pre-configured for each specific property of each control. And although most of them have a value one way by default, there are some that have a two-way mode, such as the text of an entry control, the date of a date picker, the item of a list view, among others. And although this preset value will work in most cases correctly, it is always good to know how we can modify the behavior of a binding of one of the controls.